Hello, good afternoon, Bryanston. And as they say in the disaster movies, if you're receiving this, it means that I can't be with you in person. So apologies for that. But hopefully one day we can meet. But in the interim, I'm going to try and do my presentation using a few notes to get the creative juices thinking about my topic. Trees, steel, meat, harnessing diverse perspectives around the environment. A few years ago, as a rural surveyor, I was walking across the Welsh uplands, acting on behalf of a wind farm developer, putting in high voltage electric cables. And the route of the cables for the wind farm came across another wind farm, erecting the turbines. At the same time, I was coming through farmland with cattle grazing in the fields and all the farmland wildlife to do with that. And also local communities worried about how the landscape was going to change. And for me, that crystallized lots of things into one arena, all of the trade-offs in these environmental issues with the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, and also our connection with the environment and how we eat and how we use our resources. I'm going to start with food. Meat. Meat is the big one, because meat, I'm not just talking about meat, I'm talking about food generally. And I think this is where we need context. I'm going to go back to the mid-60s, where the rising populations in Asia, India especially, were on the brink of starvation. And the Green Revolution was the result of scientists in America coming up with new solutions for fertilizer and crop species that were able to provide an amazing amount of food at just the right time to stop this starvation. So that green revolution is something that we forget about as we face the new green industrial revolution. And the reason I mention it is that we live in an economy which is driven by capitalism. And this is where it can become political, but I'm going to try and be apolitical and try and refer to the capitalist system as the way that the world operates. And it is basically an extractive system. And when we talk about food production, it has become a very linear, one-way extractive process. And so out of the Green Revolution, they could grow more crops. And then they discovered that they could grow more crops, not just to feed people, but to feed cattle and animals to create protein, because that's what the populations, especially as we're increasing wealth, were wanting. At the same time, pig production, poultry production are vital forms of protein across the world. And of course, the big one that many people don't talk about, aquaculture, fish. In many developing countries, fish is an amazingly important protein that can have quite an impact on the environment, but at the same time, technology can help it. Any form of farming practice, whether it's organic or anything that uses land, is going to remove habitat in order to create food. How many of you eat Walker's crisps? How many of you then also might spend a little bit more on kettle crisps and Tyrrells? The point I'm making is that we make choices about our food and they all have an impact on the environment. So even if you're vegetarian and you're eating just potatoes and crisps, that also has an impact on water use, on the cultivation of soils and the release of carbon, etc. I don't want to make it too complicated, but the fact is, it is very complicated. And I think this is what I want to start to kind of pitch in a few points there. The economy is based on this capitalism. And of course, as the food prices reduce, our use of resources become more efficient, waste increases. And we've seen that with all kinds of resources. So plastic is obviously a very emotive one. It's also a low-hanging fruit. It's a very easy thing for people sending magazines to change into a more combustible, compostable, not combustible, hopefully, so that we're not using the same environmentally detrimental materials. But that was pushed by a number of factors to do with public policy, public interest, the technology, the ability to provide alternatives. I saw someone the other day and they said they know someone that lives in Birmingham who bicycles across the whole of Birmingham just to buy a local apple. And they then said their life is miserable. Now, that's not to say that cycling is miserable, nor Birmingham, and nor buying local apples. But there is a perception that by changing the way that we live today is going to become hardship and go backwards, is something we need to deal with and be able to talk about in a much more proactive way. And now I'm going to move on to steel. And take you all back, let's say 5,000 years. And there's two communities, hunter-gatherers, up in the hills or the fields. No, there's no fields yet, that's the point. It's up in the hills, the woody hills of Middle England, Middle Earth. And they put down a little wooden bridge, a couple of logs across a piece of bog in order to bring these two communities together. And they decide, you know what, all this hunter-gathering is quite hard work. Let's harness our resources. Let's start farming. And so that then has informed a lot of where we are today, that ability to come together and form communities. And of course, farming was the precursor to the urbanization we see today. Steel, we use a lot of steel today as part of our urbanization. A huge amount of concrete and steel is used to create what I would call new bridges. And these are bridges very unlike the two logs 5,000 years ago. These are massive superstructures which fly over and make us more disconnected with the environment. And as Bill Gates said in his recent book, How to Deal with, say, Climate Change, unless we can deal with concrete and cement production, i.e. reduce the emissions from their production, we are still on a sticky wicket, because at this stage we are producing 50 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere. And as we drive towards this newfound drive towards net zero, and we're never going to reach net zero, but we're going to head towards it, it's going to involve various trade-offs. We have to reduce the emissions of producing concrete and steel. At the same time, we can't just rely on offsetting, and this brings me on to trees. Norway has 75% cover of trees. There's lots of wild, vicious animals, wolverines, lynx, wolves, and they inhabit these forests. Meanwhile, in the UK, 100 years ago, we only had 5% of tree cover. We've now got about 13%. And the point I'm making there is that trees are something that we're talking about as a solution to climate change. It is part of it, but it is not the only solution. And one of the trade-offs would be Norway has lots of trees and forest wildlife. It doesn't have any farmland wildlife. The UK has a huge amount of farmland wildlife, skylarks, cuckoos, lapwings, stuff that we're very culturally connected to. Deforestation is a headline people enjoy putting at the front of the newspaper. However, if we look at Europe as a whole, in the last 20 years, forest cover has increased. Now that's because in the developed Western world, we have made agriculture more efficient so that it doesn't take wild habitat and cut down trees, whereas in other parts of the world, in Brazil and the Amazon and in parts of Africa, they are cutting down forests because they want to create areas for agriculture because they want to feed their populations. And there is a tension there between the Western world saying, look, we've had all the luxuries of industrialization, you cannot do what we're doing. And so we have to deal with helping different societies move in to this zero carbon world, at the same time reduce our impact on the environment. Trees, I could go on about it, but I'm not going to, because I think that's something we can talk about another time. The environment is shifting the whole time. I think some of our expectations have to shift. In the UK, very recently, the government said we're going to plant more trees. And so we're going to lose skylarks from open farmland and maybe have more woodlarks. And that, again, will come up against those people who are negotiating for certain types of trees to be grown here. Native broadleaves only, because we're a campaigning organization and that's what we do. Whereas I would argue we should be much broader thinking and look ahead to how the climate is going to have an impact on trees and be braver to embrace other tree species, mixed conifers with broadleaves. I think that's probably enough to start off with, because the other big aspect not often talked about are the social sciences, the psychology of all of this. Someone explained to me very well that we want things black and white, binary, yes or no, simple, because way back crossing that log of 5,000 years ago, we may have heard a rustle in the vegetation in the woodland. We want to know, is it something that's going to kill us, yes or no? And so that's how we're still wired today. Do we want to know the answer quickly, yes or no? Is it a danger to me? And this can make some of these conversations on Zoom, as I'm speaking to you now, much harder. And so being able to become less tribal, instinctively we want to be tribal. Our lizard brain at the back there is where we want to hang with our friends, those people who can confirm our biases, who can enable group thinking to make us feel warm and comfortable in that we want to do good things for the environment, but we don't want to deal with the trade-offs with other people that we don't particularly like. Everyone loves to hate the big corporations, but they have a role in this transition. And I think if we can step back, be more thoughtful and analyze what's behind the headline, that can help us to become more curious. And I know I mentioned that in the introduction a few months ago. So, why do you think, for example, the producers of lab-grown meat are thinking so hard about what texture that lab meat's going to be? Not lab-free, that lab-grown meat is going to be. They're thinking of it because they want the market to want their produce. So people who are going to stop eating meat and eat a lab-grown piece of alternative, they will want the texture to be similar to what meat was. So we want that continuity, but we need to change our ways. These are subtleties, which I think is probably, we can explore again, the psychology around all of these issues, how to think, how to change and nudge people into wasting less food and to changing how we eat, because it's our health and the environment's health. I think it's probably quite a good thing in, let's say, future sessions to do some role play. So a group of you could be acting for a Shell or Esso, a big corporation. And others could be a local activist group. Others of you could be farmers, others of you could be supermarket retailers, others could be MPs and politicians trying to keep the population happy and stable with affordable food. But that's just an idea. Anyway, as Albert Einstein said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used to create them. And that's because I want to leave you with this final thought said by General Patton in 1947. Never tell people how to do things. Tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity. So on that note, thank you very much.